Max Abrahms is an associate professor of political science at Northeastern University, where he's an expert in international security, especially in the areas of terrorism, U.S. foreign policy, great power competition, and international relations in the Middle East. He's held fellowship and other research positions with all kinds of different academic institutions, including the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth, the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, the Human Security Center in London, and think tanks, including the Center on Foreign Relations. He has been on our show before to talk about the war in Ukraine. He is going to be here tonight to talk about our very different views on the Israeli war in Gaza and U.S. policy toward it. Max, so great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. We're very happy to have you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. And I actually really do appreciate that introduction, because in the tweets, you were just saying, Israel supporter or whatever. And I was going to call you out on it because I don't actually think that that does a good job of representing my views. It almost seems to imply that, I'm consistently a pro-Israel person, almost reflexively, whereas that's really not true. If you look at my foreign policy record over, say, the past 10, 12 years, on many of the most important foreign policy debates involving the United States, I haven't had a pro-Israel view. That's true with respect to my position in Syria, where I opposed helping the rebels. I opposed the bombing campaign in Yemen, right? I've been very critical about the intervention in Libya. I don't think being sort of pro-Israel is very predictive of my foreign policy views.
Matt,
I think that a much better...
Okay, just to be clear, as you well know, Twitter has extreme space constraints. I had to talk not only about our interview, but also about the other topic that we just covered. I should note as well that you also published your own tweet about your appearance tonight, and you said Glenn is a critic of Israel and an ardent supporter of the Palestinian cause, which I think isn't quite as nuanced either, but I understood it's just kind of shorthand for indicating my position on this war. And all I meant with that was that you, in this particular war that we're here to talk about, support the Israeli war in Gaza. That's all I meant by it. And as you said, when I had the space and time, I gave your full credentials. So that's, I think, just understanding that Twitter's space constraints are what they are. It was just an attempt to kind of signify that we have different views on this particular question, not to impugn your worldview in any way. So let me start with the area of agreement that we actually had and still have, which we talked about before, which is that you were, as I am and was, an opponent of the U.S. funding of Ukraine's war. And over the last, almost 2 years now, I've interviewed a lot of people who share our view, members of Congress and journalists and scholars, and most of them said, look, the United States has so many problems at home that we cannot go around funding foreign countries' wars. It's just not something that we should be doing. It's not something that we can be doing. That was, at least in part, one of my reasons for opposing the U.S. funding of the war in Ukraine, along with others. In the case of the war in Gaza, Joe Biden just requested $14 billion for Israel on top of the yearly $4 billion or so in various kinds of aid that they get, in addition to $60 billion more for the war in Ukraine. What is the difference between the two? Or, and I guess another way to ask that is, why should the U.S. government be funding Israel's wars in the billions of dollars, seemingly without limits?
Yeah, the Biden administration also confounded these issues. When he hit up the American public, he said, we need to give to Ukraine and we need to give to Israel. I view these conflicts as extraordinarily different. I don't see much of a synergy there at all. My North Star, in terms of my foreign policy positions, hasn't been so much, or at all, to reflexively support Israel, but to never be on the side of the terrorists, to not be on the side of Al-Qaeda. That was true in Syria, that was true in Yemen, that's true also in in this case with Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood is not sort of just an independent terrorist conflict that's far away. Every single branch of Al-Qaeda is cheering it on. The German intelligence just 2 days ago said that traditional barriers between Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic State, they have differences ideologically, but actually this Islamist threat has merged. Hamas has emerged as a leading actor in the global jihad. If I have a bias, it's not for Israel, but it's against terrorists.
So just to be clear, like one of the arguments for Ukraine was the reason we have to make sure Ukraine wins and Russia loses is because a win for Russia is a win for China. There's all these other groups, countries like Iran that hate us and that are also cheering for Russia to win. And so the argument was we have to get involved. It sounds a lot like that's your rationale here, not that Hamas can attack the United States, but there's all these groups that we hate that hate us and are cheering for Israel to lose, and therefore we should intervene and ensure that Israel wins. Why? It sounds like that rationale for Ukraine and Israel there is the same. So why does it convince you in the case of Ukraine and Israel to get involved with U.S. funding, but not in the case of Ukraine?
Well, it's hard for me to remember a case where China actually attacked the U.S. homeland in large numbers. I don't think it's crazy at all to think that Al-Qaeda would do so. In fact, all you need to do is go to some of these big Palestine rallies, which have gotten completely out of control. They are full of anti-Semitism and violence. And you can see people openly calling for a caliphate. They are waving flags, Glenn, of terrorist groups that are designated by the US State Department as foreign terrorist organizations, flags of terrorist organizations that actually have a history of attacking the United States. So just this week, we see PFLP flags, right? Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. These are groups that are not limited in their target selection to Israel. They hijacked the plane coming out of Los Angeles. And essentially, they were the precursors to Al-Qaeda, and that was sort of the model of the 9/11 attacks. So I think that the danger to Americans is much more real, and it's certainly not distant.
But the $14 billion that Joe Biden is asking Congress to authorize isn't going to be used to round up these bad protesters who you say are being violent, who are waving flags of terrorist organizations in the United States or the West. The $14 billion is going to be used to give Israel bombs, to drop on Gaza, to give them more weapons, to attack people in the West Bank. So why, if the United States has all these problems at home, as you say, with it's all these protesters who are being violent and who are pro-terrorist, isn't that all the more reason why the United States should focus inward and use its resources on American security rather than transferring $16 billion to Israel to pay, or $14 billion to pay for the Israeli war?
I find it extraordinarily hard to believe that that sort of sum to help Israel with its counterterrorism would in any way meaningfully undermine U.S. security in terms of our, material investments at home. I do think that it's in the U.S. interest for terrorists like Hamas to be punished and to be degraded. Again, Hamas has been, it wasn't before, but it has emerged as a very important actor in the global jihad. And even not looking at Hamas, just looking at Al-Qaeda and ISIS, U.S. Intelligence services throughout the West, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe, are saying, you know what? These organizations have had a resurgence since October 7th, and that is not good for U.S. national security.
What do you think should be done to the people who are protesting? Obviously, if you use violence, that's a crime. That's already a crime. But in terms of people who are protesting without using violence, and obviously there are a lot of them, we can fight about what percentage are using violence in these protests. I think people can see the protest and make up their own minds. But in terms of the people who are just protesting, non-violently, but they're waving flags. I guess you mean Hamas flags or Al-Qaeda flags. I haven't seen that many, but let's assume there's a good number of them. What do you think the United States government should do to those people who are protesting but not using violence?
That's a great question. There's been a lot of focus on the controversial slogan, from the river to the sea. There's been a big backlash against that. That is not actually as concerning to me because from the river to the sea, although I don't love the slogan, is an expression of a political preference. What's much more concerning is when you have people expressing approval and encouraging violent tactics. The other really big slogans that you hear at all of these demonstrations is for there to be a global antifada, an antifada revolution. In my mind, from a free speech perspective, that's a little bit more complicated because there were two antifadas, technically. Intifada 1 and Intifada 2, one in the late 80s and one after the Oslo period in the 1990s. And they both featured violence, and the second one especially was terrorist violence against civilians. And so when you have large numbers of people calling for an antifada, that is concerning to me in a way that a expression of political preferences is not. I would certainly not crack down on people for having a different political preference, but the constant expression and encouragement of violence is something that should be looked at.
We've seen at many of the counter-protests, the pro-Israel protests, we've seen in the United States and in the West, but also in Israel from Israeli officials, people who are saying things like, erase Gaza from the map, flatten Gaza, turn Gaza into a parking lot, kill them all. I've seen Israelis saying that. I've seen Americans saying that. I've seen Israeli officials saying that. Is that, in your mind, something that also is concerning and that should be looked at, or are those kinds of sentiments permissible?
Well, you would never hear me say something
No,
like
of
that.
course not. Of course not. Of course not. I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting you would,
No,
but
no,
I'm
no.
saying.
So I agree. That is concerning. It is concerning if somebody were to say flatten Gaza, because that would entail, the killing of large numbers of civilians. The killing of civilians is always terrible, and it should never be expressed or advocated as a policy position.
How about things that Nikki Haley has said and Lindsey Graham has said, which is, I think we should go just start bombing Iran. I want to drop bombs on Iran. Let's say that there are people even kind of more hawkish than they, and they say, I think we should have a mass bombing campaign. We should carpet bomb Iran. Is this the sort of thing that also should maybe be legally looked into, or is that clearly legally permissible?
Well, here's a little bit of a difference, Glenn. What you have oftentimes is on campuses throughout the United States, you have large numbers of demonstrators who are screaming at Jewish students, and they are wearing masks deliberately, and they are explicitly advertising on their flyers that the purpose of the masks is to impose costs and to intimidate, and that these students and these universities are, to quote them, complicit. And so it's not as sort of remote as just saying, oh, our policy towards Iran, which is, thousands and thousands of miles away, should be a very belligerent one. The purpose of saying and screaming at, the Jews at these universities that they're in favor of violence is to intimidate them. And I don't know of any minority group at universities that are subject to this kind of abuse, where you have the majority screaming at them that they want to use violence. They want a global intifada, which is understood to mean violence against Jewish targets, which indeed is not just some esoteric abstract concern. It is actually happening. And so I think that there's a real important difference between advocating in a very aggressive way a global intifada to, defenseless Jewish students versus a belligerent policy against Iran thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C.
Well, presumably, like if Iranians were inside the United States or other Muslims who identify with Iran and they were healing, let's go kill all Iranians, they would probably react in a similar way.
That would be really objectionable, wouldn't it?
But so, it would be objectionable, but then the question becomes, would it be something that the FBI or the police would go and investigate? And I don't think they would. Let me just also note, there is some, dispute about
the student.
Hold on, let me just finish. I'll let you answer.
The shouldn't allow it.
There is a dispute as well about the extent to which this stuff is actually happening on college campuses. Nobody doubts that there's incidents
there
like
isn't, Glenn.
No.
There isn't.
Well, if you listen,
Max,
if you just let me finish my sentence, I think you'll see that there is. There was a op-ed by two Israeli American professors in Haaretz just last week, one of whom works at George Washington University and is a tenured professor there. The other of whom works, I believe, at the University of Pennsylvania. It's another large university in the Northeast. I think it was Penn, but it might have been a different one. And they wrote an op-ed to say that they are very offended as hardcore Israeli supporters, as Israeli citizens, at the attempt to try and create this victim narrative around American Jews and American Jewish students. And I've had other Israel supporters on my program, like Batya Ungar-Sargon, who said the same thing. And what they said was their experience and the experience of many of their colleagues is that overwhelmingly, when the war in Israel and Gaza is discussed, it is civil, it is things that are things that are being done in terms of very much well within the lines of peacefulness and reasonability. I've had other professors on my show just in the past couple of weeks, including John Mearsheimer. I had Rashid Khalidi on my show. I've had other professors who work in academia who have said the same thing. So there is a dispute about the extent to which this victimhood narrative surrounding American Jewish students is being exaggerated. And like I said, many pro-Israel advocates, including the ones I've named, are saying that they are offended by this attempt to act like every pro-Palestinian or overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian protesters are being violent and threatening. But I want to just get a sense of what rules you want there to be. Yeah. Like, should masks be prohibited for everybody? Yeah, what's the rules?
Sure. Before talking about that, there needs to be an actual empirical understanding of what is going on. Anti-Semitism on college campuses, although libertarians and people on the far left like to try to diminish it, it is unquestionably on the rise. And that includes whether you restrict your sample, not just to statements, but just to violent attacks, to attacks on individuals, to throwing rocks, for example, at ASU, to setting a dorm room on fire like at Drexel. And by the way, these reports of heightened levels of anti-Semitism, they do not come from one organization. ADL, which I don't really like, has been a big punching bag, but across organizations, they are all finding the exact same thing using different methodologies. Finally, even when you restrict it to respondents who are not Jewish and who have personally witnessed what they deem to be anti-Semitic attacks, the numbers are absolutely through the roof. So it's not just Jewish self-reporting. This includes testimonies on a large N sample across authors and methodologies, also of non-Jews. And so this is a very robust finding.
All right, so just to, so people can go in and who are interested and look at the article to which I was referring. It was from 5 days ago, November 26th. The title of it was "Toxicity Does Not Rule: The Hamas-Israel Debate on U.S. College Campuses." As Jewish Israeli scholars who work in U.S. universities, we know that the image of polarization and betrayal on campus is overblown. Most students and colleagues we encounter are curious and open-minded to learn more about the Israel-Hamas war, and it's written by Sakar Pinsker, who's a professor of Middle East Studies and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and Ari Dumbov, who is the Max Thitkin Professor of Israel Studies at George Washington University. So both Israeli-American scholars who are working directly on campus, just for people who want to get that conflicting opinion.
Do they include a large N study? Do they include a large N study, or is this purely anecdotal information, Glenn?
No, they're talking
Because
about,
the large N studies disagree with them.
both GW and the University of Michigan, for obvious reasons, are centerpieces of where Israel-Gaza or Israel-Palestinian debates take place. And they're saying that it's not only their experience, but the experience of colleagues of theirs, that overwhelmingly the American college campuses are very peaceful and that these debates are being conducted, obviously with some exception.
They're not. Show me a large N study that supports that. They're all against you on this.
Well, I just referred to, I think, some evidence that I think is pretty persuasive.
Information.
Well, I don't have your study in front of me, and but I already said that people who use violence are committing crimes. So what I'm asking from you is some kind of a principle about the extent about what. Yes, yeah. I'll tell you my principle. My principle is the one under Brandenburg, that says that it actually is permissible in the United States constitutionally to even advocate for violence. Our country was born of people who said, I believe that the British Crown has become so repressive that picking up arms against the central government, against the authority, is not only justified, but morally necessary. And the case that came before Brandenburg was a KKK leader who would, hold on. Let's just have a discussion. Let me finish my thought, and then you can finish yours. I haven't interrupted you. The Brandenburg case was a KKK leader who was convicted of terrorism for saying, I believe we should use violence against the federal government if it doesn't stop being so anti-white. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overturned the conviction and said that advocating violence is clearly within the realm of protected speech, which means that you're allowed to say, flatten Gaza, erase Gaza, remove Gaza from the map. I think all Palestinians should be killed. There are no innocent Palestinians. There's a huge number this week of Israeli officials and journalists who have said there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. That's protected speech. You can go on campus and say that. You can say it in front of Palestinians. And it's protected speech to go and say, I think the Israeli government and their occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza has become so barbaric and inhumane over decades that I think violence on the part of Palestinians is justified in order to resist it. Those are both, to me, clearly within the realm of free speech. I would never send the FBI or law enforcement after students on campuses for saying these things. So I'm trying to you mentioned masks, you mentioned, people who are chanting loudly. Is there like a volume limit? Is there like a mask limit?
Yeah, sure. Let me respond.
Yeah.
So I think that there are two separate issues. I mean, one is the question of constitutionality, right? When sort of the FBI might intervene. And the other is like the school, code of conduct. You are right that certainly some offenses would be not permissible on campus, even if they wouldn't, say, land somebody in prison. But the problem is that these demonstrations, which are not all of them, but a very, a sizable number of them, a sizable portion of them, are extraordinarily disruptive. They, interfere with class. They negatively affect students in ways that shouldn't be affected. They're intended to scare them, to interfere with their ability to learn, to go to class, to meet with each other, to study, right? These are all things in violation of universities. And so that's a university issue. I'm not a lawyer, but I also personally find it problematic in a legal sense, if somebody is waving flags of foreign terrorist organizations that have a history of attacking the United States while simultaneously calling for violence against the United States at exactly the time where we're seeing elevated levels of violence against the West, and intelligence agencies are saying that these actors are indeed a real threat to the West. I actually do think that that's problematic for public safety issues, even if you err on the side of civil liberties.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.